point. It's based out of Chicago. But I was at a startup called Castle until like 2 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I am now doing project management with zero actual background in project management. So which is fine, but I'm, training myself.
Yeah, no. This, you might find this useful, you might not. We'll see.
No, I will. I had to scramble after the company went down. So.
Yeah, because they just announced they were shutting down in like January. I think they like all of a sudden just made the decision, and they're like 60 days essentially to wind it down.
Yeah, it was supposed to be 30 days, but it took 60. So, still tying up loose ends.
That's great. Well, so for anyone who's joining us online, my name is Alok Sharma from Sharma Analytics. We've got some folks in the room here at TechTown. We've also got some croissants in the room. So those of you who are live streaming, you're missing out. So we're going to talk about technology project management, specifically Agile project management, but we're going to approach this from a manner so that if you're a non-technical person, you can apply these tools and have some confidence that your team is going to deliver what you want from them when you want it. And so let me bring up my slide notes, and we're going to begin. Great. So what we do is we use data to rationalize, select, plan, and manage technology projects. We don't write code, but what we do is we manage projects. We help companies figure out the return on investment of a project. We help companies select technology vendors or platforms, things like that. And so running these projects is the core of what we do, and we think that's like the real value that we bring. We've done it a bunch of times. We've seen the pitfalls. We also know how to manage the internal resources at our clients, and we know how to manage the vendors our clients might select and other managed service providers. And so we find that regardless of the entities that are involved in your technology project, this sort of methodology works really well, especially if you have distributed teams or teams that are made up of people from different entities. So what are we going to talk about today? So the first things we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about storyboarding, wireframes, and then we're going to get into sprints. We're going to talk about poker estimation, design review, and user acceptance testing. And so the way we think about it is that storyboarding and wireframes, this is sort of the pre-work before a project starts. If a project's already started, you shouldn't feel like you can't go back and do this. It's never too late to do storyboarding. It's never too late to do wireframes. So even if it's not a situation where the horse has already left the barn, I highly recommend that if you haven't done storyboarding, you should get to it. And so storyboarding, if you want to think about it, is like what we want. Wireframes are how we want it to look. And then the sprints that's where the work gets done, right? That's where the technology is actually developed. That's where the code is written, and that's where it's delivered to you. And so the sprints happen over and over again. So they could be like a 1 week sprint, they can be a 2 week sprint. It depends on what works for your team and the complexity of the software. But we're going to start with storyboarding. And so storyboarding is something you should really do with the business users. This is something that you want to do with not just the management of these departments, but you really want to do it with the people who are doing the work that the software is going to assist. And you want to do it with the people who will actually end up using the software, in addition to their management. Storyboarding might take a number of sessions. You might do a storyboarding session with 3 different business units at an organization and then combine them all. But the idea of a storyboarding is that it's, we keep it really simple. It's in plain English, and it's I am, I want, so that. And the reason we document it in this manner is because it lends some context to the software development team about what you're really trying to get at. So an example is that if you told a builder you want a ramp on your porch, that's fine. But what's more useful to that builder is my niece is in a wheelchair and she visits me, and I want her to be able to get into my house easier. And that's why I want a ramp on my porch. Because of the context, they start thinking about all the other things that might entail that you haven't really defined. And so the issue is that if you just tell them, I want a total department invoices, the software team is just going to build that feature, exactly what you've asked of them. If you can give them some context, what happens then is they can start thinking about all the things you might want later and start building for that now, or at least allowing for that flexibility. So, for instance, if I say I want to total department invoices so that departments know their spend, automatically, as a developer, I'm realizing there's probably two interfaces. There's going to be one that a department is going to see, right? So they can just log in and see where they're at. And then there's going to be another one for the accounting team where they're actually going to see the details of it, possibly. And so storyboarding, you go on with these teams and you get all of these down. My recommendation is that you blue sky it so you don't worry about what you can build right now. Have them throw everything out there. And then, at a certain point, later you can decide what's in scope and what isn't in scope. But by having as much of this information down as possible, when you're talking to your technology teams, once again, they see where you're going to go. So they know that they're going to have to build something in 3 months, but they'll know, okay, but after these 3 months, this is probably what they're going to want us to do next. And we should probably build some flexibility into this so that we can allow for that later. So for instance, this is a storyboard that we had done for a client of ours. And we have 32 items. Granted, for the first release, we only covered, I think, maybe 12. And what we did is, we put these storyboards together with all these business units. And then we had the heads of these business units come together and help us prioritize these stories. And, these business units are going to fight a little bit about what they want. Our job isn't really our job is to make sure that they prioritize it and they all understand what's been prioritized. We don't really care so much about what their priority is, but we want complete understanding across an organization that this is the priority that we're going to build things in. This way you keep business units from all bothering you over why their thing isn't done. We've had total agreement across an organization and says, look, we've prioritized the accounting functions first, for instance. In the warehouse, you're going to get your stuff in 6 months. We're not going to build that just yet. But there's an understanding of it's coming. This is what we're going to build for you. And so that's why it's important. And that's why you really want to have, all the items down, whether you get to them right now or not. So this is a storyboard. So the size column, we have grayed out. We'll get into that a little bit later. But at this stage, what you want is, the stories and their priority. So the next thing you want to do is you want a wireframe. So a wireframe, you might be familiar with these, but it's usually a low resolution, mock-up is another word for it, but it's a low resolution way of describing how you think the pages should look. Now, granted, as you get into the development process, the developers or the user interface designers, they might come back and say, hey, we've got a completely different way of displaying this. But at least this way, it gives them an idea of what you're thinking. Now, some of the things about wireframes, you want to keep them low, depending on what you're building, you want to keep them very low res. So if you're building new features for something that already exists, then in that case, I recommend opening up a page and cutting and pasting from, taking screenshots and clipping things from the screen and dropping them into a new Paint, MS Paint doc. It can be that easy, and use elements that already exist and kind of say, here's how I think it should look, things like that. If it's brand new development, you really want to keep it this low res. You want to keep it almost handwritten. And the reason for this is because the higher res it looks, when you start showing it to users or future users, they immediately start jumping to critiquing the font and the color and the shape of the buttons. That is completely inconsequential, and that's easy to change. It's like the last stuff that you build. And you want them to stay away from that and worry, are the functions that you need on this screen? And right, so you want to completely stay away. So there's a reason that even this right here, where's my cursor? So even this right here, this is built with wireframing software. This is built with mock-up software, and it's still built, even in that software, it's still built to look handwritten, hand-drawn rather. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's very well known that the higher res it looks, the more users think it's almost done. So it's strongly recommended to stay like this. Now that being said, there are situations where, like I said, something's already been built and you're just adding features to it, in which case you might want to but yeah, so keep it hand-drawn if you can, that sort of thing. And so imagine this, what you're doing is you're kind of packaging for your developers. You're packaging a storyboard and these wireframes, so you know what it's supposed to do and how you think it should look. Once again, they'll have feedback on how they think it should look, and they'll probably come up with some really clever way of displaying this information. But this is at least a starting point. So this is like the pre-work. This is usually before you really get into it with the software developers. At this stage, you usually package this up. This is when you start getting, if you're working with outside vendors, this is when you start getting estimates. This is when you start showing it to developers so they can get a feel for who they might add to their team. If it's an internal team, do they have the people in place to do this sort of thing? After this, what we get into are the sprints. So the sprints are where the actual development happens. This is where coding happens, design, etc. And the thing to remember about these sprints is they're finite, they're iterative, and there's no half credit. So sprints traditionally are 1 week to 2 weeks long. And so what happens is at the end of the sprint, there's this idea of earned value. Meaning, at the end of every sprint, I have something that I can give to the business users. There is something that a business user can look at and touch and feel and give me feedback on whether this is right or not. So depending on the complexity of what you're building, sometimes more complex software, it's like a 2-week sprint. Sometimes it's a 1-week sprint if it's less complex. But the idea is you want to pick a sprint length and stick with it throughout your project. Inside of that sprint, by iterative, we mean the process is the same every time. And what we do is we start off with a sprint kickoff. So a sprint kickoff is we do what we call storyboard backlog grooming. And what we mean is, remember that storyboard we had created? When we have priorities on there? Every time you go into a sprint, you want to double check that those are still your priorities. The world doesn't stand still, and all of a sudden what was a priority for the accounting department 1 week, you might find the next week, they say, no, that is no longer important for us. We need to focus on some other function that we said was less important previously. And so backlog grouping is kind of resetting those priorities. Accounting might also say, hey, we realize that we've got a serious problem in our accounts payable process and we need to have some controls in place there. They might write some news stories for you and say, hey, here are these new stories. So your job during that process is to kind of go through there and say, okay, here's the new priorities, here's some new stories, where do they fit in here? Also, if there's defects, so you've released some software and accounting says, oh no, this is not tabulating properly, defects start finding their way into the storyboard as well, because they have to be resolved. And it takes time to develop that, so it makes its way into the storyboard. So that's the storyboard backlog grooming. Then what you do is you go into a storyboard and wireframe review. So in this sort of session, this is, once again in that kickoff meeting, you have your developers, your designers, the people that are involved in this process. What happens is your project managers are very likely you, or if you have a business analyst, your business analyst. Sometimes it's a subject matter expert from a department. Will walk your developers through the storyboard and the wireframes, and they will explain, here's, story A is this. They will give a little description of it. They will explain the reasoning behind the wireframe. The developers will ask questions. They'll ask for some clarity, and you kind of work through those sort of things. So you do this for, some number of stories. The first time is usually pretty painful, but you'll do it for like 20 stories or something like that. And so this happens like on the Monday of the week, usually. And you'll kind of like go through this like process of explaining to them what this stuff is, how does it look, and why we want it now. After that, the development teams do estimation. So what they do is they start estimating the size of these stories. So if you remember, I grayed out the size field before. This is when it gets filled in. And so for the sizing, we use the Fibonacci sequence. You guys remember Fibonacci? No? Fibonacci. 1, 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, so on and so forth. So what we do is we estimate up to 13. So 1 through 13. That's like the size of these features. So the size of these features, this is not in terms of like hours. This is in terms of just like size. And the reason we do this in terms of size is for a variety of reasons. Over time, teams get better. They get more familiar with the framework of it. They gel better together. And so what happens is what they think is big in the beginning is not the same as what is big at the end. And so you want them to constantly think in terms of like, right now, is this like a really big thing or is this not a big thing? The other reason we do Fibonacci instead of like a standard, 1 through 10, is because as features get bigger, there's more unknowns. And so there's more things that the developers will not realize until they're actually building this stuff. And so this is a more realistic way of representing that, like, once you start getting to the big size of things, these things like can very easily get out of control. You can realize that, oh, we actually have to make database changes, and we didn't think we'd have to make database changes. And there's all these unknowns. These guys are building this for the first time in a lot of cases, and so that's why there's a big jump from like 5 to 8 and 8 to 13. So your developers will kind of size these things in this manner. You'll note down what they say this estimate is for each of these stories. So then at that stage, what you do is you and then you agree on the story content, So what you say is, hey, you guys have estimated 20 stories, and you've come up with 80 points. Once again, we're not talking about hours or anything like that. And what you do is you'll ask the team, what do you think you can get done this week? And they'll say, okay, we think we can get, the first 7 stories done or something like that. And what you do is you add up the number, and you say, okay, you've essentially said this week we're going to do 60 story points, or however many that is. And then you kind of agree, okay, you guys can deliver this in a week or 2 weeks, whatever your sprint length is. And then they say, okay, great. So there's an agreement on what's going to be included in there and how many story points that is. So the reason this is important is because once they've committed to a certain number of story points, at the end of the sprint, when you do your user acceptance testing, you say, okay, you guys actually delivered to me 5 out of the 7 stories you said you were going to do. You really delivered to me, instead of 60 story points, you really only delivered to me 45. So next sprint, after you do your sizing, I'm only going to accept 45 points. If you tell me you can do any more than that, I'm going to be highly suspect. And so by doing this, it's this constant, 2 things happen. 1, their estimates get better because they've never really paid attention to the estimates before. So their estimates start getting better when they start realizing, oh man, every time we touch some feature, it takes twice as long as we thought it would take. So their estimates start getting better. And then also they start understanding, oh man, we really only have the capacity to deliver 50 points in a sprint. Then other things happen too. So other things happen too when people are out of town, when there's a half day, when there's a federal holiday. They start realizing if we lose a day, in a normal 5-day sprint, we can deliver 45 points. If we lost a day, we can probably only deliver 30 that week. And so this does a couple of things for you. One of the things it does for you is that as you estimate the rest of your storyboard, you can start coming up with a realistic finish date for your project. Because sooner or later, you're going to get to the point where 30 of the stories, 30 out of your 40 stories are estimated. And you can add those up. And hey, my team has a sprint velocity of 50 points a week. And I've got 300 points on my board. This is going to take 6 weeks to get done. And you can go back to your business users and say, hey, this is going to be about 6 weeks until we're finished. And if you're not happy with that date, we're going to need more resources. We need an additional developer, or you have to be realistic about which of these stories you really need right now. And so by doing this, you force all the parties to kind of come to an understanding that every time accounting adds a new feature, something is not going to get done in time because of this backlog grooming, right? So you've kind of forced everyone to be realistic about what they're expecting, and you're forcing everyone to be realistic about what they can deliver. Okay, so you've got this understanding of, hey, we're gonna deliver these 6 stories in the next week and a half, or the next 2 weeks rather. Now some of these items make sense for team, some of these items don't make sense for team. I'm walking you through how we normally do things. Some projects are not that complicated and don't require all this work. I like doing a design review. So if Monday is your day when all that other stuff got done, you get to at the end of Monday, you've got estimates, the developers have a general idea of what they're doing, and you have a commitment. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to deliver these functions, these stories. On like Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on how long your sprint is, you might want to do a design review. So depending on the complexity of what you're building. So for instance, if you're building something with a lot of business logic, so for instance, you're building some sort of tax software where there's a lot of business logic, there's a lot of checks that have to happen, there's a lot of if-thens, right? If it's the state of Michigan, check that this vendor has X license, that sort of stuff. You might ask your developer to do a design review with you. So a design review, look, you're not going to read their code and figure out what they're doing, but what you want them to do is put it down in plain English, like what the logic is behind a story that they're delivering for you. It can be this simple, like on the left, if the temperature is less than 30 degrees, check for mittens. If mittens, okay. If no mittens, issue a warning. And you might want them to walk you through their, each story in very plain English like that. Sometimes some people just prefer a flow chart, and that's good enough for them. So the reason we do this is, especially if there's like a lot of like edge cases, right? So situations that only happen on occasion. This is a way to capture them before anyone starts writing code. And this saves you a lot of time because, the more time you invest in the wrong direction, that's a lot of wasted time. You want to catch the mistakes. You want to catch the misunderstandings as early as you can. Design review is very helpful for that. Like I said, if there's not a lot of business rules, it doesn't make a ton of sense to do that. But if there are some decent business rules or logic, or it's reporting, so you're building some sort of report for someone, and there's like what's included in the report, how do you do the calculations, you might really want to see your developer do this in plain English. So this is something that happens on like Tuesday, or Tuesday of a 1-week sprint, maybe Wednesday of a 2-week sprint. You review this real quickly, make sure that it's understood. You might take it to a subject matter expert and say, hey, here's the logic that the developers are going to use. Does this look right? Developers go off, their design is approved, they're going to start writing code. At that stage, what you want to do is you want to start planning for the user acceptance testing. So this is going to be on the Friday, let's just say, Thursday or Friday, end of the sprint. At this stage, what you want is you want a user, so whoever the business user is or whoever's going to be using the software, you want to schedule an hour with them to work through what the software guides have delivered. That might be, hey, there might not be any real functionality, but maybe a new screen was built. You want the users to see the screen and give you feedback on it immediately. And the reason for this, the reason you want to do it every week or every 2 weeks, whenever the end of the sprint is because if you have misunderstood them or they haven't relayed to you properly what they want, this is your time to catch it before you've been developing for 2 months and then find out it's nowhere close to what they want or what they've described. So user acceptance testing, right? This is like, are we on the right track? Are we on the wrong track? The users might look at it and say, what would be a great feature? X. They might give you another story to add to the board. And this is when you start talking about the earned value. This is when the user says, this feature that was built matches the story that we described. You get full credit for that story. And so then, we said that was a 10-point story. You get 10 points for that. And you kind of work through all the stories and say, okay, here are the 10 stories we said we'd deliver. We're going to walk you through these 10 features on the website or app or whatever you're building. And that's how you know how many points you actually got. And maybe you find out that the team botched a couple of stories, and you say, okay, next time we're going to shoot for fewer. You kind of leave it up to the team. It's like, was your estimate wrong? Or were you just too aggressive on how many points you can handle? And it can be a combination of those things. But your team will kind of self-select, right? The next time around, they'll fix it. They'll use this information, and their estimates will be better. But when we were talking about sprints and we said there's no partial credit, the earned value thing is what we're talking about. Like, you don't get credit for half a feature. If this was a 10-point, if this is an 8-point feature and you delivered half of it, you don't get 4 points. You get 0. Over time, that corrects itself. Because then the next week, if you correct it, you'll get the full 8 points then. So over time, it evens out. But once you start giving people half credit, it's a very slippery slope. And you never really, there's no incentive for anyone to really assess their estimates or their workload. Means I was talking too long on a slide. But yeah, so that's the deal. And so then after this is Friday, Monday, you go back to it, right? You do the backlog grooming, right? Et cetera, that sort of thing. And you say, and that's the moment you say, hey, last week we got 30 points in. Let's shoot for 30 points, let's shoot for 30 points this week, right? Why were our estimates so bad? Kind of work through that. And that's how it goes. One thing I would say in general is that writing the stories, and if you've got a large project that is like an ongoing project, it's not one that has a finite deadline, right? You're building a product that that the world is using, and you're in a cycle of you're always going to be writing code, you're always going to be improving it. You want to remember that the stories in the wireframes are really operating about half a sprint ahead of everybody else. So you're actually firming up the stories in the wireframe so you're ready to present on Monday. Because you wouldn't have enough time to present to the developers on Monday if you were writing the stories that day, right? So you're really, those two, like before you get into the sprint, those two are actually happening like half a sprint before. You're working with the users, you're working with the business units, you're working with management to kind of get them to agree on those sort of things. And that's kind of why I pulled them outside of the sprint a little bit, because on Monday you should be ready to, it should all be buttoned up, you should be ready to present. And so that's how it goes. And then, you know, like that first half of the sprint with the developers, you're answering a lot of questions for them still. And you're going back to the subject matter experts. They'll come back and they'll say, hey, what happens if someone orders from Puerto Rico? Like what do we do for taxes? What do we do for shipping? Whatever it is. And, you know, so the first half of that sprint between design review, you're going back to the subject matter experts and figuring out these edge cases and what to do in these situations and getting back to them. So then the second half of the sprint, you know, you're spending as a project manager, business analyst, you're spending that time, you know, working on the next sprint, kind of getting out ahead of it. That's the deal. That's what I've got.
Thank you.
But questions? What do we have?
It's just an interesting way to hold people accountable and to get a gauge on what your team is capable of.
Yep.
And so working with the folks, the developers, minimally, it's just, I think that that's a great way to have different conversations, to understand where projects are going. I never considered holding things in that standard, but I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Based on what I've seen.
Anytime you ask a developer where a feature's at, they're going to tell you we're 90% there. But the last 10% takes like 2 fucking weeks to do.
Yeah.
So this is a way to, like, you know, normally developers are just getting yelled at. So their gut instinct is like, we're almost there, we're almost there, we're almost there, right? This in a way is giving them some relief. You gave me the estimate, I'm going to stick by your estimate. I'm not going to question your estimate. This is what we did last week, this is what we're going to do this week. And so because of that, like, their estimates get better because you're kind of relieving that pressure from them. They can honestly tell you, this is a tough feature, this is going to take some time. Or, man, we just really blew our estimates last week. And the next time we have to touch the accounting engine, we know it's going to take 2 times longer than we thought it would. You know, that sort of thing. And so you're kind of relieving some pressure from them because normally developers are just getting crap thrown at them and the priorities are just changing on a daily basis. Working in this manner allows you to account for a world that's changing, for a business world that's changing, and you're allowed to, like, change priorities, right? You can change priorities every sprint if you want to. So you're allowing for the business reality, but at the same time, you're not, like, telling developers every other day to, like, change direction, right? They know, okay, for the next 2 weeks, it's heads down and this is what I have to deliver. And so it's kind of a relief for them too, because that's not usually the direction that they go.
So I've been jumping into this role and not having the background. So we primarily work on, like, Microsoft products. We do, like, front end and back end, or like intranets. I've never used Microsoft products. I've always used Google. So I'm, like, coming in completely.
So this is what, like, SharePoint stuff?
Yes, SharePoint, Siteport.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I've gathered over the first few months is, if I don't know the actual content, I need to at least, like, be confident in the process that I'm using like this. Be okay with curveballs being thrown at me, and then also knowing how to manage personalities and work styles. Would love to hear more of your thoughts on, like, managing different personalities and work styles in this context.
Yeah. So one of the things is that for, like, the design review stuff, some of your senior developers will push back on it. There's your senior developers, and then there's like your leadership developers. Your leadership developers won't push back on it. they understand the value in doing this. Your senior developers will. What you do for your senior developers is you say, the design review is not for you, man. The design review is so that the 3 junior developers understand your thinking. And it gives you an opportunity to review their designs.
Yeah.
And it's right, and it's kind of like, hey man, I know you don't want to build these crappy features. We need to get these younger guys to the point where they can build these crappy features for you, and you can move on to the cool stuff. Like, I know you want to re-architect the thing.
Yeah.
Let's get some of this crap off your plate with design reviews, because by doing these design reviews, their understanding of what you're building is going to increase quickly. Even if they're not building the accounting function, if they understand how the accounting function works, in a couple of weeks, a couple of sprints, they might be able to step in and take some of that off your plate. And so that's because that's the most common thing, right? The developer doesn't want to do the design work, right?
Yeah.
Now one of the things that you'll find with these guys, the really brilliant ones, they tend to they focus on the big picture. They're excited about solving the big problem, but their work on the edges is sloppy as shit. They just don't care about the minutia that matters to users. They're worried about solving the big problem. And so what you find is, after they go through their first UAT, and the users are like, I put in negative numbers. You can't put in negative numbers here, right? It's humbling when the lead developer gets 0 points in his first sprint, because the users are not we're not going to sign off on any of this. And you've got these junior guys who rack up a bunch of points because they're paying attention to the little details. And so these sort of things, that lead developer does not want that to happen again. That guy is so embarrassed after that first user acceptance testing, they will not let that happen again.
I've also found it's difficult when I'm asking for an estimation. We go by hours. I say, what's your estimate on this? Well, I have to work with the process that, it sucks, but that's how the company does it.
Absolutely the worst thing.
Oh yeah. I mean, I have lots of notes for this very big company that So, but more junior guys or anybody who's giving me an estimation, I don't know how to assess that. Mm-hmm. Just ideas for how I can.
Yeah. So even with hours, if you have to do hours, you can still do poker estimation, even if you're not Fibonacci. So what you do is you have your developers together, you explain the feature, you have them all estimate the hours. And then you take the high hour, you take the low hour estimate, and you have them fight it out. So yeah, have 2 people, at least 2 people, if not more developers, have them all estimate the features. Even if they're not working on the feature, have them estimate it. Your lead developers will know the caveats. They'll be like, no man, this is going to take you way longer because this, and this. Yeah. So still force them, even if you can't do Fibonacci, still force them to do the estimation together. Yeah, and that'll help out. But remember, the estimates, it's like poker. Estimates face down, because otherwise the first person to talk ends up being like an anchor for everyone. They all trend that direction. Yeah. So the reason you want them to write it down, put it face down, and then flip them over at once is so that there's no anchor.
Right. Yeah. That's a better idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. Avoiding the anchor.
Yeah. No, because it always will, right? Everybody will look at the person and be like, man, what are they seeing that I'm not? Or why do they think it's so low? What am I making this too complicated? It happens. It's human nature.
Yeah.
So yeah, face down, have a couple of them, even if you can just get 2 of them to do it, have them all estimate everybody else's work and then come up with that. Yeah, but that still works. But yeah, the hours thing is I understand the reality of you've got a project budget of hours and you've got a spend that you got to stay inside of.
The agency world is interesting. I walked into it this is how this happens. Okay, utilization is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course. But see, if you setting aside whether you do Fibonacci or hours, if you follow this process, your utilization will be fantastic, because you'll always be able to say, for delivery to this customer, we've got 60 more points.
Yeah.
And I've got 7 guys on the team who have been able to deliver, 30 points a sprint. I can probably shed 3 or 4 guys and still deliver this on time. And especially after about the 3rd sprint, like everything starts like getting pretty tight. The estimates get better. The understanding the velocity that can be delivered gets better too. Yeah, but it usually takes 3. The first sprint's the worst. Yeah, the first sprint is like estimation sometimes will take 6 hours to do. Just awful, just absolutely awful to sit there as a business analyst or a project manager and to sit through that session is the worst. But even they get sick of it. And then like the next time, watch, it shrinks by more than half. Yeah. What else do we have? Anything else? All right. Well, folks, we're gonna sign off from LinkedIn or Facebook rather. Thanks for joining. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always drop us a line. Talk to you later, everybody.